5 killers from 1988 who thought they got away forever. In 1988, a killer could leave behind blood, sweat, and saliva and still walk away a ghost. If nobody saw you do it and your fingerprints weren't on file, you had committed the perfect crime. 5 killers from that exact year believed they had done just that. One even mocked the police by leaving terrifying notes on children's bicycles. Another mailed a letter directly to the press, bragging about what he'd done. They thought they had beaten the system. They had no idea that a ticking clock had just started, and decades later, a technology that didn't even exist in 1988 would pull them right out of the shadows. Case 1. April Tinsley. On April 1st, 1988, 8-year-old April Tinsley left her house in Fort Wayne, Indiana to grab an umbrella from a friend's house. She never made it back. 3 days later, a jogger found her body in a rural ditch. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Despite an immediate, massive manhunt, the police hit a dead end. No witnesses, no fingerprints, just a devastated community. 2 years later, the killer decided to speak. In 1990, a chilling message was found scrawled on a local barn door. "I kill 8-year-old April Tinsley. I will kill again." Then, total silence for 14 years. Just when it seemed the case was permanently buried, the killer resurfaced in 2004. He didn't strike with violence this time. He struck with terror. Residents woke up to find handwritten notes stuffed into their mailboxes and taped to young girls' bicycles. The notes detailed April's murder and threatened more. Alongside the notes, the killer left a deeply personal calling card: used condoms. He was arrogant. He thought he was untouchable. But by leaving that biological evidence, he handed investigators the exact key they would eventually use to destroy his life. In 2004, DNA testing could confirm a suspect, but it couldn't point blindly to an unknown name. So the killer remained free. 14 more years passed. The year was 2018. Forensics had evolved into genetic genealogy. Investigators took the DNA from those 2004 condoms and handed it to Parabon Nanolabs. Within days, the lab traced the genetic profile through public ancestry databases, narrowing it down to a single family tree. The tree pointed directly to 2 brothers living in Graybill, Indiana. Police didn't knock. They waited. They covertly pulled the trash from the home of one of the brothers, John D. Miller. They tested the items inside. It was a perfect, undeniable match to the DNA left on the bicycles. 30 years after he abducted April Tinsley, police finally knocked on John D. Miller's door. He confessed immediately and pleaded guilty. The ghost of 1988 was finally in handcuffs. Case 2. Melissa Ann Tremblay. 11-year-old Melissa Tremblay wasn't supposed to be playing near the Lawrence, Massachusetts rail yard. It was September 11th, 1988. While her mother was inside a nearby social club, Melissa wandered the busy downtown streets. She never returned. The next afternoon, a rail worker spotted something on the tracks. It was Melissa. A passing freight carriage had amputated her left leg. At first glance, it looked like a devastating accident. A child wandering in the dark, caught by a multi-ton machine. But the killer had staged the scene. He wanted the train to grind away the evidence. 70 feet away from the tracks, investigators found the real story. The dirt was heavily churned, showing signs of a ferocious struggle. Melissa's small denim purse was discarded nearby. The autopsy revealed she hadn't died from the train. She had been brutally beaten, stabbed in the neck and torso, and placed on the tracks after she was already dead. The killer walked away clean. He left no murder weapon and no fingerprints. For 34 years, the Lawrence rail yard kept his secret, but he didn't realize Melissa had fought back. During the attack, she had clawed at her assailant, trapping microscopic scrapings of his skin and flesh beneath her fingernails. In 2014, cold case investigators finally extracted a DNA profile from that tiny degraded sample. By 2022, genetic genealogy had advanced enough to map that profile to a specific family tree. The DNA led investigators to Alabama, straight to Marvin Skip McClendon Jr., a retired corrections officer who had lived just miles from the rail yard in 1988. He was arrested, extradited, and put on trial for murder. But science doesn't always guarantee a courtroom victory. In November 2024, after a deadlocked first trial, a second jury was forced to weigh the decades-old DNA against circumstantial gaps and defense arguments about contaminated evidence. After 6 days of deliberation, the verdict was read: not guilty. McClendon walked free. The technology successfully hunted down a name, but 36 years of erased time proved too difficult to overcome in front of a jury. Case 3. Patricia Ann Howell Jacobs. The hardest cold cases aren't always mysteries. Sometimes, investigators know exactly who the killer is. He sits right across from them. He looks them in the eye. But without physical proof, the law demands they let him go. Daniel Andrew McGinnis was a known predator with a violent history against women. Detectives were certain he belonged behind bars. In 1988, certainty wasn't enough. On the evening of October 5, 1988, Patricia Ann Howell Jacobs stepped out of the Silver Spur nightclub in Silsbee, Texas. She vanished into the dark. The next morning, her body surfaced in the murky waters of the Neches River. A month later, searchers found her driver's license and personal belongings discarded under a rural bridge. Detectives immediately brought McGinnis in. He had the profile. He had the proximity. The investigators pressed him, looking for a crack in his story. None came. Traditional detective work hit a solid brick wall. There were no witnesses, no digital footprints. The physical evidence collected from the river yielded nothing under 1980s microscopes. The police had to let McGinnis walk out of the station. He slipped away, and Patricia's file grew cold on a shelf. 30 years passed. Patricia's family refused to let the silence hold. In 2018, they begged the Texas Rangers to open the file one last time. The Rangers bypassed the old interview notes. They went straight to the physical evidence vault. They pulled Patricia's clothing, fabric that had been sitting untouched in an evidence locker, waiting for a technology that finally existed. The Houston Crime Lab ran the old fabric through modern DNA analysis. They extracted a microscopic biological profile and fed it directly into SOTUS, the national database. The hit was instantaneous. It was Daniel Andrew McGinnis. The man who walked out of the interrogation room in 1988 could not outrun a biological match in 2022. Arrested and confronted with the undeniable genetic proof, McGinnis pleaded guilty. The ghost they always knew was finally locked away. Case 4. Judy Chamberlain. Some killers drive for hours to bury their crimes in the woods. Others simply rely on the chaos of the city to do the hiding for them. In July 1988, 21-year-old Judy Chamberlain was found strangled and sexually assaulted in the dark basement well of a highly trafficked Boston building. Hundreds of people walked right above her, completely unaware. The killer chose his location perfectly for the era. In 1988, a heavily populated building was a forensic nightmare. The crime scene was swimming in contamination. Fibers, hairs, and footprints belonged to dozens of innocent residents and maintenance workers. For detectives, finding the killer's biological footprint was like trying to find a single specific drop of water in an ocean. The physical evidence was simply too chaotic to untangle. The investigation stalled. The basement was cleaned, the building moved on. For over 2 decades, the killer's identity stayed buried under layers of city dust. But science didn't need a pristine crime scene. It only needed one microscopic, uncontaminated trace. 23 years later, in 2011, forensic analysts successfully isolated a clean DNA profile from the 1988 evidence. They fed it into the federal database. It pinged instantly. The system handed them a name: Carl Vega. In 1990, Vega had been forced to submit a DNA sample after being convicted of an unrelated 1987 rape. But an old database hit isn't an immediate conviction. The killer had enjoyed decades of freedom, and investigators were not going to risk losing him in court. They played the long game. It took another 13 years of silent, meticulous police work to build an airtight, bulletproof case around that single genetic match. Finally, in July 2024, 36 years after he left a young woman in a Boston basement, Carl Vega was convicted of first-degree murder and handed life in prison without parole. Case 5. Anna Jean Kane. October 23, 1988. Perry Township, Pennsylvania. The body of 26-year-old Anna Jean Kane was discovered along a quiet stretch of woods. The young mother had been beaten and strangled. Investigators scoured the dirt road. They gathered statements. They ran down leads. Nothing stuck. The trail of physical evidence simply vanished into the Pennsylvania woods. A year and a half later, the killer couldn't handle the silence. He wanted the credit. In February 1990, a letter arrived at the Reading Eagle newspaper. The envelope was from an anonymous, concerned citizen. The author didn't just claim responsibility for Anna's murder. The letter laid out agonizing, intimate crime scene details that investigators had intentionally kept hidden from the public. Only the murderer could have written those words. The killer had essentially mailed the police a written confession. But without a name or a return address, the letter was just another taunt. The police filed the envelope away in a cardboard box. For 32 years, that envelope sat in the dark. The killer thought his anonymity made him bulletproof. He didn't realize he had mailed investigators his own biological profile. In 2022, cold case detectives extracted DNA from the dried saliva used to seal that 1990 envelope. It was a flawless match to the DNA found on Anna's clothing. Genetic genealogy mapped the profile and finally spat out a name: Scott Grimm. Police moved to make the arrest, but time had already taken its toll. Grimm had died of natural causes 4 years earlier, in 2018. To close the case with absolute certainty, investigators pulled a direct DNA sample Grimm had submitted during a 2002 police encounter. Ironically, that 2002 arrest was for mailing similar threatening letters to a business partner. The DNA was an undeniable match. Grimm had taken his secret to the grave, but 2022 science simply dug it right back up. The men who killed in 1988 shared one fatal blind spot. They believed the only threat was the police. They never anticipated that millions of everyday citizens were about to build a trap for them. In the 2000s, commercial ancestry kits exploded in popularity. Millions of people swabbed their cheeks or spit into plastic tubes, simply looking to map their heritage or find a lost relative. They mailed their biological data off and uploaded their profiles to public databases. They didn't know they were building an inescapable net for cold-blooded killers. Forensic genealogists realized a radical new truth. They no longer needed a killer's direct DNA in a criminal database to catch him. They only needed his third cousin to take a family history test. By taking the microscopic scrapings, the dried saliva, and the degraded fluids left behind in 1988, and feeding them into these massive public networks, analysts could identify distant relatives. From there, they worked backward. They mapped birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census records, moving branch by branch down the family tree. Eventually, the massive web narrowed down to a single generation, then a single household, then a single undeniable name. In 1988, the passage of time was a killer's greatest weapon. Every year that passed erased memories, silenced witnesses, and buried physical evidence deeper inside forgotten police storage vaults. But science flipped the script. Time was no longer protecting the killers. It was simply giving technology the decades it needed to catch up. 5 men walked away from bloody scenes in 1988, convinced they were ghosts. They left taunting notes on children's bicycles. They staged train accidents. They sat in interrogation rooms and smiled at detectives. They mailed handwritten letters to the press to brag about their perfect crimes. They mistook 30 years of silence for victory. But the silence wasn't an escape. It was a ticking clock. And when the timeline of 1988 finally collided with the science of the modern era, the ghosts had nowhere left to hide.